The United States has long been regarded as the leader of the free world, but under its current president, it's not quite inspiring the confidence it once did. Indeed, some have been musing rather publicly about whether it's even time for the U.S. dollar to be supplanted as the benchmark global currency. With us now for a wide-angled view of all of that, in New York, New York, Adam Tooze, the Shelby Cullom Davis Chair of History at Columbia University, Director of the European Institute, and author of Crashed: How a Decade of Financial Crises Changed the World, which won the 2019 Gelber Prize. And Professor Tooze, we're delighted to welcome you back onto TVO. How are you doing tonight?
Delighted to be here.
In a piece that you published a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times, you did write, whether or not a recession is imminent, there has certainly been a collapse of confidence. And my first question is, confidence in what and by whom?
Well, the place this shock happened was really in the financial markets of the world. We saw a sudden surge in demand for government debt, for government bonds, which has its reflection in a collapse in interest rates. The more popular bonds are, the higher their prices, the lower the interest rate that the borrower has to pay to get their hands on money. And we saw this across the financial markets of the world. And I think if we dig into why that's happened, there are a bunch of long-term reasons why you might expect the interest rate to be falling. The rich societies of the world are slowing down, their growth is slowing down. Demographic shifts are happening in most societies, which cause growth to slow down. Savings rates globally are high, and so there is an abundance of funding. But there was also a short-term shock to confidence, really in the first two quarters of this year, as the realization sank in that the chances of a return to normality, if you like, the chances of a return to the world before President Trump looked increasingly slim as both China and the United States dug in for what looks as though it may be a protracted trade war, and indeed something even deeper than that, a dissociation of the American and Chinese economies, a kind of uncoupling of decades of globalization. That's a profoundly unsettling reality for investors to have to deal with.
Well, that's investors. Let me ask you about small business, because we're told that confidence among U.S. small businesses actually surged with Donald Trump's election, but it has apparently collapsed now to a 7-year low. Do you think small business owners have lost confidence for the same reason that institutional investors, whom you just described, have?
I think that's probably fair. It took a while, as you say, that the Trump bump was most pronounced in that small business owning class in the US. There's been an extraordinary divergence between what economists call soft and hard numbers, with the confidence levels of self-identified Republicans in the United States surging and staying high. People have been asking for a long time when the soft and the hard numbers are going to reconverge, and it may be that the first half of 2019 is that moment. We've seen a decline in investment numbers in the US. And after all, even if the vast majority of businesses in the United States are not really linked deeply to globalization, nevertheless, there is a real sense, I think, that something may be broken here. And in any case, the long recovery from 2008, which is now the longest in American economic history, has got to come to an end at some point. And this might be that turning point moment.
Let me ask you about Mark Carney, the outgoing governor of the Bank of England, who I guess I should describe as one of this country's best-known exports. At the end of August, at the U.S. Federal Reserve's annual symposium, he actually recommended that the world financial system ought to reconstitute itself around a new virtual currency and not the U.S. dollar, which I know caught a lot of people, a lot of eyebrows went up when he said that. What's your view on that possibility?
Well, I think Carney is really articulating a view which has been around in the global analytic community, people of a more adventurous bent, it has to be said, for a while now. There is something profoundly anomalous about a situation in which the dollar remains overwhelmingly the most important currency of international trade, of international finance, of international reserve holding by central banks and sovereign wealth funds around the world. And yet, as we all know, America's share of the global economy has progressively declined, so that it is now really just one piece of a thoroughly multipolar global economic organization. And that discrepancy creates serious problems, especially for emerging markets, but also for larger economies whose entire monetary cycle, whose entire financial cycle is heavily influenced by events in the United States. And events in the United States over the last couple of years have been pretty chaotic. We have a president who seems to be at war with the central bank boss that he himself appointed. And this sends disturbing shocks through the global economy, and it reawakens the call for a new global currency. Now, Carney's a really clever operator, so he tied this up with the talk that we've had of new types of currency issued by the private sector. But this idea of what he calls a synthetic hegemonic currency has been around for a while, and the Chinese, most importantly, in the spring of 2009, came out in favor of such a proposal. So some people, perhaps rather unkindly to Carney, read this as part of a bid for a new job after the Bank of England role at the IMF. I think that's very unlikely to happen now. But it's certainly the sort of talk that goes down well in Beijing.
I hear you, but notwithstanding what Mark Carney said, the U.S. dollar is at least a real thing. This new synthetic hegemonic currency is not a real thing. It's a virtual thing. How would the markets not find that rather disturbing?
Well, I mean, by comparison with a currency whose interest rates are set by a beleaguered Federal Reserve under pressure from a populist president, by comparison with a currency whose head of state, Donald Trump, regularly tweets demanding that its value should fall, by comparison with a currency where you have United States Congress engaged in a huge borrowing binge. That's the reality of the dollar as it currently stands. And you can easily see, I think, why investors might prefer a harder, quote unquote, synthetic currency, which will be made out of a basket of international currencies, presumably, a little bit like the so-called special drawing rights of the IMF. Many people, I think, sort of shrugged their shoulders at the Carney proposal and said, well, we've already got that. And various people over time have suggested that the IMF's currency, the SDR, might emerge as an alternative to the dollar. But really, it's the politics which are decisive here, along with the deeply entrenched interest in maintaining the dollar, because everyone else is already committed to the dollar. So you have profound network effects. And it's very difficult to see how a blue sky proposal like the one that Carney launched could really break the hold of the existing system. The drumbeat of observers and commentators suggesting that we're on our way to a global recession has really risen in the last few weeks in particular. And I suspect the attacks on Saudi Arabia the other day by we're not exactly sure who have probably not lessened it at all. Trump has apparently authorized the release of oil from the U.S. Strategic Reserve, which is a pretty rare undertaking. America first notwithstanding, does it look to you like Uncle Sam is going to be riding to the rescue again? I don't think that seems like a terribly plausible scenario. In light of the continuing aggression on the trade war front, the United States is likely to remain under the Trump administration as a disturbing, destabilizing force. I mean, it's not for nothing that a former president of the New York Fed came out recently on Bloomberg arguing that the single most destabilizing factor in the world economy right now is the White House, and as such, central bankers cannot be neutral with regard to the upcoming election in 2020. So I don't see the US really here as a major source of stability. The Fed could potentially cut, which would relieve pressure on other monetary systems. It would certainly help if as Trump has himself suggested, the dollar was not rising in value. That would lower pressure on borrowers around the world, notably in the emerging markets who have got large dollar liabilities. It's not easy to see how the US could act really as a source of extra demand through further fiscal policy, given that it's already running very substantial government deficits. Perhaps the Republicans would want to plunge even deeper into deficit. We know they love a tax cut. But it's not really obvious where that juice would come from the American side.
So at the risk of stating the obvious, 11, 12 years ago, many people would observe that Barack Obama, in effect, saved the world financial system, given bringing to bear all of the levers that he had at his disposal in the U.S. government. Can we legitimately conclude this time that it seems highly unlikely that Donald Trump is going to be interested in spending his money to prop up other places around the world?
Well, Barack Obama launched a huge stimulus. That was the real action of the executive branch. Most of the action in terms of saving the world economy, as you put it, in 2008-9 was by way of the Fed. The Fed is already pretty heavily extended. The US executive branch and Congress have already, as it were, run up very substantial deficits. It isn't obvious to see where that extra push can come from. On the other hand, it's also extremely unlikely, I think, that we will be facing anything like the global financial heart attack that we saw in 2008-9. That's not the risk. It's important to be clear about that. That's not the risk that we face right now. What we're looking at is a much more classic common or garden recession, brought on perhaps by the drumbeat of trade war talk. But that isn't the same phenomenon. It's not the same risk or challenge to policymakers as the collective and simultaneous collapse of all of the major banks of the Western world was in 2008.
Professor Tooze, we've got a banner underneath you on the screen right now that says "Indispensable Nation No More," with a question mark at the end, playing off, of course, Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State's comment that America was the indispensable nation around the world. Certainly President Trump has had other ideas around that, but I wonder if, in your view, if the Democrats reclaim the White House in January 2021, do you think America will return to its ways of trying to be the world's indispensable nation, economically, militarily, and in every other which way it can imagine?
Yeah, I mean, I think that phrase, the indispensable nation, can be taken two ways. I mean, one is that America must lead on every issue, and without American leadership, nothing will ever get done. And furthermore, America should have its way on every issue. And I think that vision, under one would hope, presumably under a Democratic administration, is dead and buried. Indeed, a more charitable reading of Donald Trump's administration would be to say that he's buried that ambition too, because instead he's substituted America first. If, on the other hand, you take America, the indispensable nation, to simply mean that without the United States, it's difficult to imagine any of the major global problems being solved at the pace and with the determination and scale that we need, say climate change, then it seems to me that it remains true that America is indispensable to most of the major global problems that we face. And one would not expect a Warren administration in any way to back away from that. On the contrary, I mean, broadly speaking, her foreign policy is internationalist and lies in the continuity of left to center Democrats all the way back to the Clinton period. The one proviso one would add, I think, is over trade policy, where, hailing from the left wing of the Democratic Party, she is much more overtly skeptical than any potential leader of the Democratic Party we've seen in quite a while, other than Bernie Sanders in 2007-8. But that's, I think, the only qualification. In other respects, she talks the talk with regard to NATO that you would expect. You clearly see a desire on her part to be a leading force on climate change and on human rights as well. So I don't see any fundamental retreat there, but a shift in emphasis to one of America being a cooperative partner, and a vital cooperative partner, rather than being a kind of belligerent nationalist disturber, frankly, of international order of the type that we've seen for the last couple of years. Well,
regardless, you have described the world in rather unhappy terms lately. Here's the quote: "We are trapped between an erratic Trump, a dysfunctional Europe, and an authoritarian China." Do you see a way out of this trap at the moment?
Well, a lot depends on the course of the democracies both on either side of the Atlantic. I mean, and one would, of course, include Canada in this as well. A lot depends on the outcome of the American election in 2020, and a great deal depends on whether or not the Europeans are able to break the logjam that has paralyzed Europe and the Eurozone in particular as a source of macroeconomic policymaking for recent years. And there are signs in that direction. The ECB's initiative of last week is quite dramatic when looked at in detail. Draghi has really, left the stage with a bit of a bang. And across Europe, even in Germany right now, there is a much greater openness about issues of fiscal policy activism. And there is, after all, an enormous agenda of investment needs waiting for European politicians if they are willing to take up that baton. So I'm not fatalistic. But it is absolutely essential that we do see that leadership on both sides of the Atlantic. And if the American election in 2020 goes to Trump, then we are looking at a reality fundamentally changed from that we might have expected 5 to 10 years ago.
Well, we've certainly seen an attempt at global leadership from the Chinese, who are increasingly trying to be big players on the world stage. And you have described that as a fearsome prospect. And I wonder if you could tell us why you feel that way.
Well, I think it has two dimensions to it. One is that China has demonstrated a remarkable capacity to generate economic growth, transformation of its domestic society and economy, and rather remarkable capacity to manage their economy in the short run. I mean, one of the really striking things about the latest phase of the trade war is that the Chinese have come through without a true implosion of their economy. They've been handling this crisis with the full range of economic policy instruments that you would expect, and one might rather wish that Western states would employ too. So that's one side of this. We have a highly competent, ambitious actor here that now operates at global scale. They're the largest lender to governments around the world, larger than the World Bank and the IMF put together. That's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation, especially since 2012, is the bursting of any illusion that we may once have had about the likelihood of the Chinese Communist Party relinquishing its grip on Chinese politics. With Xi, we've seen a dramatic turn towards a more authoritarian vision of the Chinese future. And in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong, of course, we have test cases right here, right now, of the intent of this regime in dealing with, I think, in Xinjiang, a grossly exaggerated threat to Chinese stability, and in Hong Kong, a rather manifest challenge to the authority of Beijing. And the basic, gist of that story is not one that should give liberals any optimism. In 1989, in Tiananmen Square, from the West, we, after all, projected onto that experience the hope of a fundamental transformation of China. I think that prospect is now very remote indeed, and the most that most of us, I think, are hoping for is the exercise of restraint on the part of Beijing in the awareness of how damaging a full-throated demonstration of violence would be, especially in Hong Kong. In Xinjiang, that's already underway, it has to be said, but it's very remote and is not a place that the West identifies with in the way that it identifies with Hong Kong.
At the risk of getting off the path, talking about the international economy at the moment, I do want to follow up on what you just said. Do you see anything happening anywhere in the world right now that would give those who believe in the majesty of the liberal international order any reason for optimism?
There's very little indeed, to be honest. Even on the climate side, we've avoided catastrophe in the sense that the threat by the Americans to withdraw from Paris is still in the works. They haven't actually delivered. But of course, we have the disaster in the Amazon. So we're treading water at best. And it does, as I've said, depend crucially on politics. It depends on the ability of more internationally orientated political forces, both in the United States and across Europe, to win that argument and then to formulate effective, coherent policy in response to the challenges we face. The democracy offers no guarantees. It is a political process that constantly challenges both citizens and democratic leaders to rise to the challenges that we face. And right now, one has to say that the record is, after all, consistently disappointing.
Let me, just in our remaining moments here, read a quote to you from Robert Kagan, the foreign policy observer and so-called liberal interventionist, who wrote a few weeks after Donald Trump's victory the following. He said, Americans after 1920 managed to avoid global responsibility for 2 decades. As the world collapsed around them, they told themselves it was not their problem. Americans will probably do the same today. And for a while, they will be right. Because of their wealth, power, and geography, they will be the last to suffer the consequences of their own failures. Eventually, they will discover again that there is no escape. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the saving grace of our current situation is that we're not living in the aftermath of World War I. Those kind of analogies obviously have a drama to them, and you can see the appeal of making that comparison. There is this fear across the world, in many places anyway, of American withdrawal, of American isolationism. But in many places, of course, American activism has not been simply benign. And most fundamentally, in the current moment, we aren't living in the aftermath of an epic total war that cost the lives of billions of people and has radically and dramatically transformed global finance and the global economy. We have challenges. They're massive challenges. America, as I've said, is indispensable to a constructive resolution of the problems that we face. But one of the mercies of our current moment, and one of the things that makes comparisons with that interwar period, the 1920s and 1930s, I think, fundamentally misleading, is that we aren't living in the aftermath of total war. We are living in the aftermath of the unresolved tensions of one part of the Cold War in East Asia. We didn't win the Cold War in East Asia, and that is a reality that we still have to come to terms with.
I, in a way, even hate asking this question just 18 years to the month after September 11th, 2001, but America tends to get very engaged in the world when it's attacked. And Donald Trump clearly has wanted to see America disengage from many of its former responsibilities around the world, or what it saw as those. While no one wants to see America attacked again, or at least I hope most thinking people don't want to see America attacked again, what's it going to take for that country, for I guess your adopted country, to get re-engaged on the world stage?
Well, I mean, I think even more remarkable about Donald Trump is his ability to imagine America being intact in ways that it is not. I mean, think of the migrant treks and so on. I mean, he lives in a world of, it's not paranoid, but he lives in a world of, dark threats, carnage, as he likes to describe it. And that is, if anything, even more poisonous. So relying in a democracy on that threat of external danger and so on is a profoundly, I think, toxic form of politics that we really need to break. And the liberal, the truly democratic case for American internationalism needs not to be based on that kind of prospect. It needs to be based on the well-understood self-interest of America, but also its broader understanding of the collective good. And that is what I see the left wing of the Democratic Party articulating, a combination of a desire to pull back from excessive commitments made in the 1990s and in the wake of 9/11, a desire to pull back from those, whilst on the other hand, to refocus attention on the issues that really do matter, which are basically about crafting a sustainable and more just economic future and also political future, both for the United States, its immediate region, and the wider world. And that is not something that I think is productively energized by threat. So that would be the very last thing that I would wish for America right now, is some new shock of that type.
Professor Tooze, we're always grateful when you spare some time for us here on TVO, and I hope the next time you're up in Toronto, you'll look us up. We'd love to have you on the program again right here in our studio.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Take good care.
You too.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.